If you are over 60 and you have ever lost someone to cancer, or sat in a waiting room turning a magazine over in your hands without reading a single word, waiting for results that could change everything, then you already know something that no statistic can capture. It is not just the disease, it is the helplessness, the feeling that it arrived like weather, that there was nothing you could have done, that your body simply decided to betray you, and you never had a vote. I need to tell you something. In the majority of cases, that is not true. I am Dr. George, and I have spent years studying what the research actually shows about how cancer takes hold in the body after 60, what accelerates it, and most importantly, what slows it down. A landmark study published in the journal Nature estimated that 70 to 90% of lifetime cancer risk is driven by environmental and lifestyle factors, not genetics, not fate, not luck. Factors that include, very prominently, what you put on your plate 3 times a day. Now, I will never insult your intelligence by claiming that any food cures cancer. That is not what the science says. But what the research does show, across decades of population studies involving hundreds of thousands of people, is that specific foods contain compounds that actively interfere with the biological processes cancer depends on to grow. Not in theory, in documented, measurable, reproducible ways. Today, I am ranking 5 of them for you, from genuinely protective to something the data suggests may be the most powerful natural anti-cancer food you can buy at any grocery store in America. The 5th is a drink that half the world consumes daily, and most Americans completely overlook. The 4th is a common fruit that becomes significantly more protective when you prepare it one specific way. The 3rd is small, dark, and contains a compound so potent that researchers have tested it directly on precancerous cells in human clinical trials. The 2nd has been used in kitchens for 5,000 years, and the data on what it does to stomach and colorectal cancer risk is striking. And the 1st, the one I saved for last, contains a molecule that pharmaceutical companies have spent millions trying to replicate in a lab. But before we start, let me tell you about Evelyn. 73 years old, retired music teacher from a small town in Virginia. Her mother died of colon cancer at 61. Her older sister was diagnosed with breast cancer at 67. Evelyn sat across from me and said, "I have been waiting for my turn. I just want to know if there is anything I can do besides wait." What I told Evelyn that afternoon is exactly what I am about to tell you. And I want you to understand something before we begin. Every single one of these 5 foods works through a different biological mechanism. One targets inflammation. Another disrupts the blood supply tumors need to grow. Another switches on genes that your body uses to destroy damaged cells before they become dangerous. They are not 5 versions of the same advice. They are 5 different doors into the same protective system. And when you combine them, the effect is not additive. It compounds. That is what makes this list different from every other list you have seen. Let us start with number 5. Green tea. Now, I can already hear some of you. Tea? That is the big revelation? Stay with me. Because the compound inside green tea that researchers are interested in is not the caffeine and it is not the flavor. It is something called EGCG, epigallocatechin galat. And what EGCG does inside your body is quietly remarkable. EGCG interferes with a process called angiogenesis. That is the formation of new blood vessels. Every tumor, in order to grow beyond a tiny cluster of cells, needs to recruit its own blood supply. It sends out chemical signals that convince nearby blood vessels to sprout new branches toward it, feeding it oxygen and nutrients. Without that blood supply, the tumor stays small, starved, and manageable. Your immune system can handle it. EGCG disrupts those signals. The Osaki study in Japan followed over 40,000 adults for 11 years. Women who drank 5 or more cups of green tea daily had a 23% lower risk of dying from any cause compared to those who drank less than 1 cup. The Shanghai Women's Health Study, which followed nearly 70,000 women, found that regular green tea drinkers had a 37% lower risk of colorectal cancer compared to non-drinkers, with a clear dose-response relationship. The more they drank, the lower the risk. I want to be honest with you about something here, because I think you deserve honesty more than reassurance. A Cochrane review, which is the highest standard of evidence analysis in medicine, looked at over 140 studies on green tea and cancer and concluded that the evidence is promising but inconsistent. Not all studies agree. Not all cancer types show the same benefit. That is the truth. But the pattern across large population studies, particularly for digestive cancers, is consistent enough that I drink green tea every single morning. And I am not someone who does things based on hope. I do things based on patterns in data. 2 to 3 cups a day, no sugar. If the taste is too grassy for you, a small squeeze of lemon actually increases the bioavailability of the catechins. Let it steep for 3 to 5 minutes to release the EGCG fully. A box of quality green tea costs less than $4. That is roughly 13 cents a cup. Not a bad price for a compound that multiple research groups around the world continue to study for its anti-cancer properties. Now, number 4. And this one surprised me when I first read the research, because it involves a food that most people eat regularly, but almost nobody prepares in the way that maximizes its protective potential. Tomatoes. Specifically, cooked tomatoes. The compound responsible is called lycopene. It is the pigment that gives tomatoes their red color. And lycopene has been studied more extensively in relation to prostate cancer than almost any other dietary compound in existence. The health professionals' follow-up study tracked nearly 50,000 men over more than a decade. Those who consumed tomato sauce 2 or more times per week had a 23% lower risk of prostate cancer overall. For advanced aggressive prostate cancer, the kind that spreads beyond the gland, the reduction was even more striking, roughly 35%. But here is the detail that changes everything. Raw tomatoes showed a much weaker association. The protection was concentrated in cooked tomato products, tomato sauce, tomato paste, stewed tomatoes, roasted tomatoes with olive oil. Why? Because lycopene is locked inside the cell walls of the raw fruit. Your digestive system cannot extract it efficiently. Heat breaks those cell walls open. And fat, particularly olive oil, makes lycopene dramatically more absorbable. A raw tomato in your salad is fine. A tomato sauce simmered with olive oil is medicine. Evelyn did not like tomatoes. She told me this with the kind of firmness that suggested the conversation was over. I asked her if she liked pasta sauce. She said she could tolerate it. I told her to tolerate it twice a week with a generous pour of extra virgin olive oil, and that her body would do the rest. She rolled her eyes, but she did it. And what happened to her inflammatory markers 3 months later is something I will share with you before we are done. A dose-response meta-analysis published in Prostate Cancer and Prostatic Diseases in 2017 reviewed 42 studies and found that for every additional 2 milligrams of dietary lycopene per day, prostate cancer risk decreased by approximately 1%. That may sound small, until you realize that a single cup of tomato sauce contains over 30 milligrams. The math favors you heavily here. 2 to 3 servings per week. Cooked, with a healthy fat. Tomato sauce on vegetables, tomato soup with olive oil, roasted cherry tomatoes on a salad that has already been dressed. The preparation matters more than the quantity. And gentlemen, if you are over 65, this one is speaking directly to you. 3 more foods to go, and the next one has been tested directly on precancerous cells in human beings, with results that made researchers stop and redesign their next trial. Number 3. Berries, specifically the dark ones. Blueberries, blackberries, and their close relative that oncology researchers have become increasingly interested in, black raspberries. The compounds responsible are called anthocyanins. They are the pigments that give these fruits their deep purple and blue-black color. And unlike many dietary compounds that show promise in a petri dish but fall apart in the human body, anthocyanins have been tested in actual clinical trials on actual precancerous tissue in actual people. The results are worth your attention. A phase 1 clinical trial published in Clinical Cancer Research took 20 patients with colorectal cancer and gave them 60 grams of freeze-dried black raspberry powder daily for 1 to 9 weeks before their scheduled surgery. When researchers examined the tumor tissue after surgery, they found something remarkable. Tumor suppressor genes that had been silenced, switched off by a process called methylation, had been reactivated. Proliferation markers had decreased. Apoptosis markers, the signals that tell damaged cells to self-destruct, had increased. The berries were not killing cancer cells directly. They were reactivating the body's own surveillance system, turning the alarms back on in cells that had gone quiet. A separate multi-center, placebo-controlled trial tested a black raspberry gel on patients with precancerous oral lesions. After 12 weeks, the treatment group showed statistically significant regression of the lesions and reduced genetic damage at tumor suppressor sites. The placebo group showed no comparable changes. These are not observational studies where researchers ask people what they remember eating 10 years ago. These are controlled interventions with tissue samples and genetic analysis. Now, I want to be straightforward. These trials were small. They were early phase. They do not prove that eating a handful of blueberries every morning prevents cancer. What they show is that the compounds in dark berries have measurable biological activity against the mechanisms that drive cancer progression. And when you combine that clinical evidence with the population data showing consistent associations between berry consumption and lower cancer risk, the picture becomes difficult to ignore. A handful every morning, fresh or frozen. Both retain anthocyanin content, on oatmeal, in a smoothie, or straight from the container. Evelyn chose frozen wild blueberries because they were $2 cheaper than fresh, and she said she liked the way they tasted slightly crunchy before they thawed completely. I told her that was perfectly fine. Your cells do not care whether the berry was expensive. Number 2. Garlic. This one has been in kitchens for 5,000 years. Hippocrates prescribed it. Ancient Egyptian laborers ate it daily. Your grandmother probably cooked with it without ever knowing she was deploying one of the most studied anti-cancer foods in the scientific literature. The active compound is allicin, which is produced when garlic is crushed or chopped and exposed to air. Allicin breaks down into a cascade of sulfur-containing compounds that research has linked to multiple anti-cancer mechanisms, including the inhibition of carcinogen activation, enhanced DNA repair, reduction of cell proliferation, and induction of apoptosis in damaged cells. The epidemiological data is striking. A meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition pooled the available evidence and found that people who consumed the most garlic had approximately a 30% lower risk of colorectal cancer and roughly a 47% reduction in stomach cancer risk compared to those who consumed the least. A separate meta-analysis in gastroenterology, covering over 500,000 subjects, found that high allium vegetable consumption, garlic being the primary contributor, was associated with a 46% lower risk of gastric cancer. I should be honest with you about something here, because that is what I promise to do in every one of these videos. More recent prospective studies, the kind that follow people forward in time rather than looking backward, have shown weaker results for garlic and colorectal cancer specifically. The stomach cancer data remains strong. The colorectal data is mixed. And garlic supplements, the capsules you can buy at the pharmacy, have not shown the same protective association that real, whole, crushed garlic has. The pill is not the food is the medicine. The technique matters. Crush or chop your garlic and let it sit for 10 minutes before cooking. That waiting period allows the allicin to fully form. If you throw chopped garlic straight into a hot pan, the heat destroys the enzyme before it can do its work. 10 minutes. Set a timer. Then cook it gently. Not charred, not blackened, just softened. 2 to 3 cloves a day, worked into whatever you are already cooking. If you are someone whose spouse complains about the smell, tell them it is doctor's orders. That line has worked for at least 3 of my patients that I know of. And here is where I want to ask you something. Because I think about this often, and I genuinely do not know the answer. How many of you grew up in a household where garlic was used every single day? Where it was just part of how food was made, not a health decision, just a flavor decision? And how many of you moved away from that as processed and convenience foods became the norm? I think about the generation that cooked with garlic and onions and fresh tomatoes every night and never thought of it as medicine. They just called it dinner. And I wonder sometimes if the healthiest thing any of us can do after 60 is simply go back to cooking the way our grandmothers did. If that thought resonates with you, or if you have a memory of someone in your family who cooked that way, I would love to hear about it. Those stories remind me why this work matters. Now, number 1. The food I saved for last. Because the evidence behind it made me fundamentally rethink how I talk to every patient over 60 about their diet. Cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, cabbage. The compound responsible is called sulforaphane, and what sulforaphane does inside your body is unlike anything else on this list. It activates a genetic pathway called NRF2, which controls your body's production of phase 2 detoxification enzymes. These are the enzymes that neutralize carcinogens before they can damage your DNA. Think of them as your body's internal hazmat team. Sulforaphane sends them a signal to suit up and get to work. But it does not stop there. Sulforaphane also inhibits histone deacetylases, enzymes that cancer cells use to silence tumor suppressor genes. In other words, it reverses one of the key mechanisms cancer uses to hide from your immune system. It reactivates the very genes whose job is to find damaged cells and destroy them. The same mechanism the black raspberries targeted, but through a different molecular doorway. The data across cancer types is the most consistent of any food on this list. A meta-analysis of 35 studies found an 18% lower risk of colorectal cancer in people with the highest cruciferous vegetable intake. A separate meta-analysis showed a 15% reduction in breast cancer risk. For lung cancer, a systematic review found a 22% risk reduction in case control studies, with an even more dramatic protective effect in people with specific genetic profiles that make them more vulnerable to carcinogen accumulation. And for prostate cancer, pooled data showed approximately a 10% reduction, though the evidence was stronger in some study designs than others. No single food on this list has evidence across that many cancer types simultaneously. That is why it sits at number 1. 3 to 5 servings per week, steamed, lightly roasted, or raw. Overcooking destroys the myrosinase enzyme that produces sulforaphane, so do not boil them until they turn gray. If you roast them, keep the centers slightly firm. A squeeze of lemon after cooking has been shown to help preserve the active compounds. Let me come back to Evelyn. She started with the tomato sauce twice a week because it required the least effort. Then she added the blueberries. Then she began cooking with garlic the way her mother used to, letting it sit chopped on the cutting board while she prepared everything else. The broccoli came last, because she said she had spent 73 years not enjoying broccoli, and she was not about to pretend otherwise. I told her to try roasting it with olive oil, salt, and a little parmesan until the edges got crispy. She called me 2 weeks later and said, "I owe broccoli an apology." At her 3-month follow-up, her C-reactive protein, a key marker of systemic inflammation, had dropped by over 30%. Her doctor noticed. Evelyn noticed more. She told me she was sleeping better. She had more energy in the afternoons. She said she had stopped waiting for her turn. That sentence stays with me. because that is what this information does when it reaches the right person at the right time. It does not just change blood work. It changes the story someone tells themselves about what is possible. 5 foods: green tea, cooked tomatoes, dark berries, garlic, and cruciferous vegetables. Every one of them available at your local grocery store. Not one of them requiring a prescription. All of them backed by published research you can verify yourself. Everything in this video is general educational information based on current medical research. It is not personal medical advice. Before making any dietary changes, please speak with your physician. They know your history and your full medical picture. That context always matters more than anything I can share in a video. Take care of your body. It has carried you through every year of your life without ever sending you an invoice. Feed it something worthy of the work it has done. And if there is someone in your life right now, a spouse, a sibling, a friend, who has been touched by cancer or who lives with that quiet fear of it, maybe this is the conversation you have with them this week. Not with fear, just with food. Sometimes the most important thing you can give someone is not comfort. It is information they did not know they needed.